I booked a trip to Bali with his best friend. Ryan found out and called me a cheater. But what happened next will shock you. His own best friend turned against me too. Ryan stood in our kitchen holding my phone with this look I'd never seen before and said, "Jessica, what is this?" And I knew exactly what he'd found, but I wasn't about to admit anything wrong, so I told him, "It's just a trip, Ryan. You're completely overreacting like always." But his hands were actually shaking as he scrolled through my messages with Marcus and said, "You've been planning this behind my back for 3 weeks." And I couldn't believe he was making such a big deal out of nothing, so I said, "Marcus is your best friend. Why would you think something inappropriate is happening?" But Ryan just kept staring at me like I was a stranger and said, "Because you lied to me, Jessica. You've been lying to me this whole time." I could see him reading through our messages, and his face was getting redder and redder, and he said, "Listen to this. Jessica, you wrote to Marcus, 'I can't wait to wake up next to you in paradise.' What the hell does that mean?" And honestly, I'd forgotten I'd written that, but it was obviously about waking up in paradise, meaning Bali, not anything inappropriate, and I told him, "You're taking that completely out of context, Ryan." But he kept reading and said, "And this one, Ryan would never understand what we have together. Jessica, what do you have together with my best friend?" And I said, "A shared passion for photography, obviously." But Ryan said, "Photography, Jessica, really, that's your excuse for emotional cheating." And I couldn't believe he was using that phrase, because nothing about my relationship with Marcus was cheating. It was purely creative collaboration. The worst part was how he was acting like I'd committed some terrible crime, when all I did was book a photography workshop in Bali with Marcus, who happens to be a professional photographer. And Ryan should have been supportive of my creative interests, instead of immediately assuming the worst about his own girlfriend and best friend, but apparently wanting to expand my horizons, makes me some kind of villain in his mind. And I told him, "You're being paranoid, Ryan. This is exactly why I didn't tell you, because I knew you'd react like this." But he said, "React like what, Jessica, like? Someone who just found out his girlfriend is planning a romantic getaway with his best friend." And I said, "It's not romantic, it's educational. Marcus is teaching a workshop." But Ryan said, "Then why didn't you tell me?" And honestly, I couldn't give him a good answer to that, because the truth was, I knew he'd try to stop me. Let me back up and explain how this all started, because Ryan is making it sound way worse than it actually was. And the whole thing began as just an innocent conversation about 3 weeks ago when we were watching some stupid Netflix show about polyamory. And I made a joke about how maybe we should try an open relationship just to see how he'd react. And honestly, I was expecting him to laugh, or at least play along. But instead, he got this serious look and said, "I would never want that. Jessica, I only want to be with you." And something about the way he said it so definitively made me feel trapped, like he wasn't even willing to consider that. Maybe I might want something different, and I said, "It was just a hypothetical, Ryan, calm down." But he said, "Good, because I never want to share you with anyone." And that word share just rubbed me the wrong way, because I'm not some object to be possessed, and I started thinking about how suffocated I felt in our relationship. That same night, I was scrolling through Instagram and saw Marcus had posted these incredible sunset photos from his trip to Thailand, and I commented, "Teach me your secrets." And he messaged me privately, saying, "I'm actually planning a photography workshop in Bali next month if you're interested." And something about the timing felt like the universe was telling me to do something adventurous for once, instead of staying trapped in this bubble Ryan had created around us. So I said, "Tell me more." And Marcus sent me all these details about this amazing resort and the daily photography sessions and how it would be perfect for someone wanting to learn professional techniques. And honestly, it sounded like exactly what I needed to feel alive again. So I said, "I'm in." And Marcus said, "Really, that's awesome, Jessica. I'll send you the booking details." The next few days I kept thinking about the trip and how excited I was to finally do something for myself without having to ask Ryan's permission, like I was some teenager. And when the booking confirmation came through, I felt this rush of freedom that I hadn't experienced in years. So I transferred the money immediately and started planning what cameras to bring and researching the best spots for sunrise shots. And I was genuinely thrilled about learning from Marcus, who's been published in National Geographic and has won all these awards for his landscape photography. So this was a real opportunity for me to develop my hobby into something more serious and professional. But every time I thought about telling Ryan, I knew he'd find some way to ruin it for me with his jealousy and possessiveness, so I decided to wait until closer to the departure date and give him less time to sabotage my plans. And honestly, it felt good to have something that was just mine for once, without his input or approval, because our entire relationship had become about what Ryan wanted, and when Ryan wanted it, and I was starting to lose myself completely, which isn't healthy for anyone. Meanwhile, Marcus and I were texting back and forth about the workshop details, and he was so helpful, answering all my questions about what equipment to bring and what the weather would be like, and which excursions would be best for different types of photography. And I have to admit, it was refreshing, talking to someone who understood my creative interests, instead of Ryan, who always acts bored when I mention photography, and changes the subject to his work, or his video games, or whatever else he thinks is more important than my passions. Marcus would text me every morning with these thoughtful messages like, "Good morning, Jessica. Hope you're having a great day. I found this amazing lens rental place in Bali that has the 70 to 200 millimeter you were asking about." And it felt so nice to have someone who actually paid attention to what I'd said, instead of Ryan, who can't even remember what camera I have, even though I've told him 100 times. And when I showed him Marcus's helpful messages, Ryan just grunted and said, "That's nice," without even looking up from his video game. One evening, Marcus sent me this incredibly detailed breakdown of the best camera settings for different lighting conditions, and he'd clearly spent a lot of time putting it together, just for me. And he wrote, "Jessica, I can tell you're really serious about improving your photography skills, and I respect that so much. Most people just want to take pretty pictures, but you actually want to understand the technical side." And honestly, reading that made me feel so validated, because Ryan always says my photography is nice in this patronizing tone, like he's humoring a child's hobby, instead of recognizing that I'm genuinely passionate about learning and growing as an artist. Marcus also sent me links to all these professional photography blogs and YouTube channels that I'd never heard of, and he would explain why each photographer's work was significant and what techniques I should pay attention to. And honestly, I was learning more from our text conversations than I'd learned in years of trying to figure things out on my own. And when I tried to share some of these resources with Ryan, he said, "Jessica, you're getting really obsessed with this photography thing. Maybe you should focus on your actual career," which was so dismissive and unsupportive that I stopped trying to include him in my interests altogether. The more Marcus and I texted, the more I realized how much I'd been missing in terms of intellectual stimulation and creative support. And he would ask me thoughtful questions like, "What draws you to landscape photography specifically?" And, "Have you ever considered trying portrait work?" And we'd have these deep conversations about art and creativity that went on for hours. And honestly, it was the first time in years that someone had shown genuine curiosity about my thoughts and opinions, instead of just waiting for their turn to talk about themselves. Marcus started sending me examples of his own work, with detailed explanations of his creative process, and he'd write things like, "I took this shot at golden hour in Tuscany last year, and I think you'd really appreciate the way the light hits the cypress trees." And then he'd explain all the technical details about aperture and composition, and I felt like I was getting a private masterclass from a real professional photographer. And when I tried to show Ryan some of Marcus's incredible work, he barely glanced at my phone and said, "Yeah, it's good, I guess," which showed how little he understood about artistic vision and technical skill. One night, Marcus called me because he said it was easier to explain some of the more complex photography concepts over the phone, and we ended up talking for almost 3 hours about everything from camera equipment to travel experiences. And he told me about this amazing sunrise he'd captured in New Zealand, where he'd hiked for 2 hours in the dark just to get the perfect shot. And I found myself thinking about how adventurous and dedicated he was compared to Ryan, who won't even walk to the corner store if it's raining, and complains when I want to wake up early on weekends to catch good light for my photos. And during that call, Marcus said, "Jessica, I can hear the passion in your voice when you talk about photography, and that's so rare to find." And honestly, it meant the world to me that someone finally recognized my enthusiasm as something valuable instead of annoying. Marcus told me about this incredible temple where the light hits perfectly at golden hour, and how we'd wake up early to catch the sunrise over the rice terraces. And honestly, just talking about it made me feel more alive than I'd felt in months, because Ryan and I never do anything adventurous anymore. We just stay home and watch TV, or go to the same boring restaurants, with the same boring conversations about his coding projects and my marketing campaigns. And I realized I was wasting the best years of my life being comfortable instead of actually living. One night, Marcus called me to go over the final itinerary, and we talked for almost 2 hours about photography techniques and travel experiences, and he told me about all these amazing places he'd been, and I found myself thinking about how much more interesting his life was compared to Ryan's, and how Marcus actually listened when I talked about my dreams of maybe freelancing as a photographer someday, instead of just dismissing it like Ryan always does by saying, "It's a tough industry, Jessica, you should stick with marketing," like he knows anything about my capabilities or ambitions. During that conversation, Marcus mentioned how he'd always thought I had a good eye for composition based on my Instagram posts, and that he was excited to help me develop my skills. And honestly, it felt incredible to have someone believe in my potential for once, instead of constantly discouraging me from taking risks. And I started wondering why I was settling for someone who didn't support my growth, when there were people like Marcus who actually wanted to see me succeed. The next morning, Ryan noticed I seemed happier than usual and asked what was going on, and I almost told him about the trip, but something held me back, and I just said, "Nothing special, just looking forward to the weekend." And he said, "We should do something fun together," and suggested another Netflix binge. And honestly, the idea of spending another weekend on the couch watching his boring action movies made me want to scream. So I said, "Actually, I was thinking of visiting my sister," which was a lie, but I needed space to think about everything. That weekend, I drove to the coast by myself and spent hours walking on the beach, thinking about my relationship with Ryan and whether I was truly happy or just comfortable. And I realized that comfort isn't the same as fulfillment, and maybe I deserved to be with someone who challenged me and encouraged me to grow, instead of someone who wanted to keep me in this safe little box forever. And when I got home, Sunday night, Ryan asked how my sister was, and I said, "Fine," and went straight to bed because I couldn't handle pretending everything was normal when I was having all these doubts about our future together. The trip was only 2 weeks away when Ryan found my phone and discovered everything. And honestly, his reaction proved exactly why I hadn't told him, because he immediately assumed the worst, instead of trusting me, and believing that I could have a platonic friendship with his best friend, which says more about his insecurities than it does about my intentions. And when he accused me of planning to cheat, I was genuinely hurt that he thought so little of me after 3 years together. But the most shocking part was what happened next, because while Ryan was standing there, yelling at me about betrayal and lies, my phone started buzzing with messages from Marcus, and Ryan grabbed it before I could stop him and read them out loud, and Marcus was saying, "Jessica, I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I don't feel comfortable with this trip anymore. I think we should cancel." And Ryan looked at me with this expression of complete disbelief and said, "Even Marcus thinks this is wrong." And I couldn't understand why Marcus was suddenly backing out when he'd been so excited about the workshop just days before. Then Ryan called Marcus right there in front of me and put him on speaker and said, "Marcus, what is going on with this Bali trip?" And Marcus sounded really uncomfortable and said, "Look, Ryan, I didn't realize Jessica hadn't told you about it. And honestly, some of the things she said made me think she might have the wrong idea about what this trip was supposed to be." And I couldn't believe Marcus was throwing me under the bus like that, when all I'd done was express excitement about learning photography from him, and maybe mention that Ryan didn't understand my artistic side, but that's completely normal to share with a friend. Marcus continued talking and said, "She kept talking about how trapped she felt with you, and how she needed to experience life with someone who understood her better. And I started to realize she might be looking for more than just photography lessons. And Ryan was staring at me the whole time Marcus was talking, and I wanted to interrupt and explain that Marcus was misunderstanding everything. But Ryan held up his hand to stop me and said, "Go on." "Marcus, tell me exactly what she said." And Marcus said, "She asked if I thought she was attractive and said she wondered what it would be like to be with someone more adventurous." And honestly, I might have said something like that, but it was just hypothetical girl talk, not some kind of romantic proposition. Then Marcus said the thing that really made Ryan lose it, and he said, "She told me she'd been thinking about what it would be like to kiss someone else and asked if I'd ever thought about her that way." And Ryan's face went completely white, and he looked at me like he'd never seen me before and said, "Jessica, did you really say that to my best friend?" And honestly, I might have gotten carried away during one of our late-night conversations, but it was just curiosity, not some serious plan to cheat on him. By this point, Ryan looked completely disgusted and said, "Jessica, is this true? Did you really say those things to my best friend?" And I tried to explain that Marcus was taking everything out of context and that I was just expressing normal feelings about wanting more excitement in my life. But Ryan said, "You were planning to cheat on me, weren't you?" And I said, "No, Ryan, that's not what this was about at all." But he said, "Then why didn't you tell me about the trip?" And I said, "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this." And he said, "React like someone who doesn't want his girlfriend going on romantic getaways with other men." And honestly, his choice of words proved that he would never understand my perspective. Marcus was still on speakerphone, and he said, "Ryan, I'm really sorry, man. I should have called you the minute she booked this trip, but I thought maybe she had told you, and you were okay with it." And Ryan said, "She told me nothing. Marcus, absolutely nothing about any of this." And Marcus said, "I feel terrible about this whole situation, and I want you to know I never would have agreed to go if I'd known she was keeping it secret from you." And I couldn't believe how quickly Marcus had turned against me, when just yesterday, he was telling me how excited he was about showing me his favorite photography spots. Then Marcus said something that made my blood run cold, and he said, "Ryan, there's something else you should know. She asked me not to post anything about the trip on social media because she didn't want you to find out." And Ryan looked at me with this expression of pure betrayal and said, "You asked him to keep it secret." And I said, "It wasn't like that, Ryan. I just didn't want drama." But he said, "Drama or evidence, Jessica, which one were you really trying to avoid?" And honestly, I didn't know how to answer that because maybe I had been trying to avoid leaving evidence, but only because I knew Ryan would misinterpret everything. Marcus then said, "I'm cancelling my part of the trip. Ryan, I don't want any part of this mess." And Ryan said, "Thank you, Marcus, I appreciate your honesty," and hung up the phone and turned to me and said, "Pack your bags, Jessica, we're done." And I couldn't believe he was ending our 3-year relationship over a misunderstanding. So I said, "Ryan, please let me explain, this isn't what you think." But he said, "I know exactly what this is. Jessica, you were planning to cheat on me with my best friend, and you're only sorry because you got caught." And honestly, his refusal to even listen to my side proved that he never trusted me in the first place. The next few hours were the worst of my life because Ryan started packing his stuff immediately and wouldn't even look at me when I tried to apologize and explain that I never intended to hurt him and that the trip really was about photography. And maybe I had developed some feelings for Marcus, but that didn't mean I was planning to act on them. And Ryan said, "Feelings, Jessica? You just admitted you have feelings for my best friend." And I realized I'd made everything worse by being honest about my confusion. I tried calling Marcus to get him to explain to Ryan that I'd never actually propositioned him or suggested anything inappropriate, but Marcus had already blocked my number, and when I tried messaging him on Instagram, I discovered he'd blocked me there too, and I couldn't understand why he was being so cruel when all I'd done was be open about my feelings and maybe get a little carried away with the fantasy of what our trip could be like. But that's completely normal for someone feeling trapped in a stagnant relationship. My friends started calling because apparently Marcus had already told everyone what happened, and they were all taking Ryan's side without even hearing my version of events. And my best friend Sarah called me crying and said, "Jessica, how could you do this to Ryan? He's such a good guy." And I said, "You don't understand, Sarah. I've been feeling so unfulfilled lately, and Marcus made me feel alive again." But she said, "That doesn't excuse emotional cheating, Jessica." And honestly, I was hurt that even my closest friends were abandoning me when I needed support the most. Then my friend Lisa called, and she was even worse than Sarah because she said, "Jessica, I can't believe you would betray Ryan like this after everything he's done for you." And I said, "What exactly has he done for me, Lisa?" And she said, "He supported you through your mum's cancer scare last year, and he helped you get that promotion at work." And honestly, I couldn't believe she was throwing those things in my face like they were some kind of debt I owed him, when that's just what partners are supposed to do for each other. And I told her, "That doesn't mean I have to stay trapped in a relationship that's not fulfilling me." But she said, "So you decided to cheat with his best friend instead of talking to him about your problems." And I said, "I didn't cheat, Lisa. I just developed feelings." But she said, "Same thing, Jessica," and hung up on me. Even my sister called, and she was supposed to be on my side, but she said, "Jess, I love you, but this was really wrong." And I said, "You of all people should understand what it's like to feel trapped in a relationship." Because she'd complained for years about her boring husband before she finally divorced him, but apparently that was different. And she said, "I didn't plan secret trips with other men, Jess. I got counseling and tried to work things out first." And I said, "Counseling wouldn't have helped. Ryan isn't willing to change." But she said, "How do you know that if you never gave him the chance?" And honestly, everyone was acting like I was supposed to sacrifice my happiness to protect Ryan's feelings. Ryan packed his stuff that same day and moved back in with his parents and blocked me on everything. And Marcus blocked me everywhere too. And all our mutual friends stopped answering my calls, and I had to cancel the Bali trip and lost all my deposits, which was almost $3,000, that I'd saved up for months. And honestly, the financial loss hurt almost as much as losing Ryan, because I'd been so excited about that photography workshop, and now I'd never get to experience it. I still don't understand why wanting some freedom made me the villain. Subscribe if you think loyalty still matters in relationships. Hit like if you would never do this to your partner's best friend, and tell me, was she really just seeking freedom or planning to cheat all along?